In 2026, archaeologist Avraham Faust published a new interpretation of a stone found inside Building 101 at Tel Eden, an Iron Age town in the Judean lowlands. The object was not a tablet, and it carried no royal name. It was a standing stone, roughly 1.4 meters high and estimated to weigh about 750 kilograms. During the first phase of the building, it stood upright in one of the largest and most inward rooms. Its position was deliberate. A person entering the residence could see it, and so could people gathered across much of the central courtyard. Then something changed. Before the building was destroyed near the end of the 8th century BCE, the stone was lowered onto its side. It was not broken into construction rubble or carried away. Instead, builders surrounded it with masonry and turned the place where it had stood into a stone platform. A cooking pot later found on top shows that the platform was not an abandoned ruin. It became part of the building's working life. That sequence is confirmed by the excavation. The interpretation is not. Faust argues that the stone was probably a masbah, a cultic standing stone, and that its removal from display may belong to the religious changes traditionally associated with King Hezekiah of Judah. The biblical account says Hezekiah removed local shrines and smashed standing stones while directing worship toward Jerusalem. Tel Eden appears to preserve a standing stone taken out of ritual use during the right century, inside a residence that may have belonged to the local elite. But the stone was not smashed. Its exact date of concealment is unknown. No inscription says who ordered the change, and no surviving decree names Tel Eden. So what has actually been discovered? Evidence of a kingdom-wide religious revolution? A local household abandoning an older ritual? Or an ordinary renovation that later history has made more dramatic than the archaeology allows? The answer matters because the debate is much larger than one stone. It concerns how a regional kingdom tried to control worship, how later biblical writers remembered that process, and what archaeology can reasonably prove when an object records an action but not the motive behind it. A king remembered as a reformer. Hezekiah ruled Judah during one of the most dangerous periods in the kingdom's history. To the north and east, the Neo-Assyrian Empire had become the dominant military power of the region. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen to Assyria in the late 8th century BCE. Refugees, imperial pressure, expanding administration, and the fear of invasion transformed Judah before Assyrian forces finally moved against it. The most famous external record is not biblical. Sennacherib's royal annals describe his western campaign of 701 BCE and identify Hezekiah as the king of Judah who resisted Assyrian authority. The annals boast that Assyria captured fortified towns, restricted Hezekiah inside Jerusalem, redistributed parts of his territory, and extracted a large tribute. Monumental reliefs from Sennacherib's palace depict the siege and capture of Lachish, Judah's most important city after Jerusalem. These sources confirm the political crisis. They do not mention a religious reform. 1. That claim comes primarily from biblical literature. The Book of Kings describes Hezekiah as a ruler who removed high places, broke standing stones, cut down a sacred pole, and destroyed the bronze serpent known as Nehushtan. A later passage places an accusation in the mouth of an Assyrian representative. Hezekiah had removed local shrines and altars and told Judah to worship at one altar in Jerusalem. Chronicles expands the program into a broader purification, reorganization of worship, and campaign against local cult places. On the surface, these texts appear to describe a decisive centralization of religion. Local worship was restricted. Jerusalem gained authority. The king's political capital also became the kingdom's approved sacred center. Yet historians cannot simply read these passages as administrative reports written during Hezekiah's reign. Kings and Chronicles are literary works shaped by later authors, editors, theological concerns, and retrospective judgments. Kings treats Hezekiah as a model ruler. Chronicles gives his religious program far more detail. The two accounts preserve traditions, but they also explain the past through the religious priorities of later periods. This creates a difficult historical problem. If Hezekiah really closed local cult sites, archaeology might preserve damaged altars, buried ritual objects, blocked shrines, or sacred features incorporated into later architecture. But each of those patterns can have another cause. Buildings are renovated. Sacred objects are retired. Cities are destroyed. Political centers lose funding. A shrine can disappear because a king prohibited it, because a family changed its practices, or because war made its continued use impossible. The reform is therefore neither a fact proved by the text nor an invention disproved by archaeology. It is a historical hypothesis. Tel Eton has become important because it adds a type of evidence that has rarely appeared in this debate, a cultic change not in a public temple or city gate, but inside an elite residence. The house on the hill. Tel Eton stands in the southeastern Shephelah, the zone of low hills and valleys between the coastal plain and the Judean highlands. The mound occupied a strategic landscape. Roads linked the region north and south and connected the coast with the Hebron Hills. Fertile valleys surrounded the site. By the 8th century BCE, Tel Eton had become one of the larger settlements associated with the Kingdom of Judah. Archaeologists commonly, though not universally, identify it with the biblical town of Eglon. That identification is less important to this particular case than the site's final Iron Age phase. Excavations revealed a densely occupied, planned settlement destroyed in a severe conflagration near the end of the 8th century BCE. Pottery and regional comparison have led excavators to cautiously associate that destruction with Sennacherib's campaign in 701 BCE, although the exact attribution is not beyond debate. Building 101 stood near the highest point of the mound. It was large, well constructed, and positioned above much of the town and surrounding land. Its architecture included features associated with substantial Judahite houses, but its scale and location distinguished it from ordinary dwellings. Excavators have therefore described it as an elite residence and have suggested that it may have housed a governor or another prominent household connected with local administration. The word governor must remain a proposal. No official archive was found naming the resident. But the building clearly represented wealth and authority. It was carefully planned, constructed with quality materials, and altered through several phases. The final fire sealed rooms, pottery, tools, food remains, and other objects beneath collapse. This gives archaeologists an unusually detailed picture of how space was used before destruction. 2. The standing stone belonged to an earlier internal arrangement of the building. It was not found upright because the Assyrians knocked it down. It had already been deliberately lowered and built into the platform before the final catastrophe. That sequence is crucial. The stone's ritual role ended while the household and the building continued. The location is equally important. This was not an object set at the edge of a property and forgotten. In its upright phase, the stone occupied one of the building's largest inner rooms. Its line of sight connected the entrance, courtyard, and interior. Whatever meaning it carried, it had been placed to be encountered. A standing stone in the ancient Levant could mark divine presence, a covenant, a memorial, a boundary, an ancestor, or a place of ritual action. Context determines meaning, and context is often incomplete. At Tel Eden, the prominent position and later careful treatment support a cultic interpretation. They do not identify the deity, ritual, or theology attached to it. This is the first discipline the evidence requires. The stone tells us that it mattered. It does not tell us exactly why. What the stone was before it fell. The Hebrew term masbah is commonly translated as standing stone or pillar. Such stones appear in biblical texts in both accepted and condemned settings. In some stories they mark encounters, agreements, graves, or acts of commemoration. In later Reform narratives they become objects to be destroyed. The category was therefore broader than a simple label for an idol. The Tel Eden stone was uncarved, at least in the evidence published so far. There is no face, divine symbol, dedication, or text. That absence is not unusual for an iconic cult, where a stone can represent presence without depicting a human-shaped deity. But an uncarved stone is also easy to overinterpret. Archaeologists must rely on placement, associated space, sequence, and comparison rather than a direct inscription. The strongest case for a ritual function rests on 4 observations. First, the object was large enough to require deliberate transport and erection. Second, it stood in a prominent interior location rather than serving an obvious structural purpose. Third, its visibility appears to have been planned. Fourth, when its upright function ended, it was treated differently from ordinary building stone. It was carefully placed on its side and enclosed rather than casually fragmented. The treatment suggests that the household wanted the stone to stop doing what it had done before, while avoiding its destruction. That is a subtle but significant distinction. Removing an object from sight can neutralize its social and ritual power. Concealing it inside a platform can transform sacred space without converting the sacred object into common debris. There are several possible reasons for such behavior. The household may have accepted a new religious rule. A new family may have occupied the residence and rejected the earlier practice. The internal organization of the house may have changed. A ritual object may have been retired because it was damaged, outdated, or associated with a deceased ancestor. The platform itself may have supported a new activity that had nothing to do with royal policy. But look at the chronological setting. The change occurred during the century in which Judah expanded its administration, encountered refugees from the fallen northern kingdom, confronted Assyria, and developed new arguments about national identity and the authority of Jerusalem. Religious practice was not isolated from those pressures. The stone does not need to prove the complete reform narrative to be historically valuable. Even the narrower conclusion is important. An elite Judahite household removed a prominent cultic feature before the Assyrian destruction and continued using the building afterward. 3. If evidence-led investigations like this are valuable to you, subscribing helps support documentaries that keep the mystery without sacrificing the limits of the evidence. The next question is the difficult one. Can the action be dated closely enough to connect it with Hezekiah? The date that makes the claim possible. Archaeological interpretation often depends less on an object than on the events above and below it. At Tel Eden, the final destruction provides the upper boundary. The stone had been laid down, the platform had been built around it, and the platform was in use before the building burned. A cooking pot discovered. on its upper surface belongs to that period of continued activity. Therefore, the concealment did not happen after the city fell. It occurred earlier. The excavators date the destruction to the late 8th century BCE and cautiously connect it to Sennacherib's campaign. This fits the broad historical setting of Hezekiah's reign. Josiah, the other Judahite king famous for centralizing worship, ruled in the 7th century BCE, after Tel Etan's Iron Age. Town had been destroyed and abandoned. If a royal reform explains the stone's removal, Hezekiah is chronologically more plausible than Josiah. But this is where a possible connection can easily become a false certainty. Faust explicitly acknowledges that the excavation cannot currently determine how long before the destruction the stone was dismantled. It may have happened near 701 BCE. It may have occurred years earlier. The sequence places it in a relevant period, but it does not produce a precise date or a named ruler. The dating of the destruction itself is also expressed cautiously. The pottery assemblage resembles the destruction at Lachish, which is securely associated with Sennacherib's campaign through archaeology, Assyrian reliefs, and texts. Some elements at Tel Etan could be slightly earlier. Archaeomagnetic research supports destruction during an Assyrian campaign in the late 8th century but does not by itself identify the specific army or year with absolute certainty. Why does that matter? Because the historical argument contains two separate steps. First, the stone was deliberately removed from its upright role before the town's destruction. That is strong. Second, Hezekiah's government ordered that removal as part of a kingdom-wide religious program. That is an inference. The destruction layer makes the inference possible. It does not make it inevitable. A responsible documentary must keep those levels separate. Confirmed, the stone changed position and function. Strong interpretation, it was cultic. Plausible historical connection. The change occurred in the era traditionally associated with Hezekiah's reform. Unproven claim, a royal order from Jerusalem caused this specific household to conceal it. That may sound cautious, but caution does not weaken the discovery. It shows exactly where the discovery adds weight to the debate and where the evidence stops. The other shrines of Judah. Tel Etan does not enter an empty discussion. For decades, archaeologists have debated possible evidence of cultic centralization at Arad, Beersheba, and Lachish. At Beersheba, stones from a horned altar were found reused in later construction. The altar had clearly been dismantled before the Assyrian destruction. This has often been connected with Hezekiah's reform. 4. Yet the original location of the altar is unknown. No complete temple was found around it, and reuse could reflect architectural change, political disruption, or another local decision. At Arad, archaeologists uncovered a small sanctuary inside the fortress. Its features included an altar, incense altars, and standing stones. At some point, cultic objects were removed, laid down, or buried. The site became central to arguments that worship outside Jerusalem had been deliberately stopped. Chemical analysis later identified cannabis and frankincense residues on the small altars, confirming that the shrine had hosted real ritual activity. The problem is chronology and cause. Some scholars connect the sanctuary's decommissioning with Hezekiah. Others associate it with military events, administrative changes, or respectful burial of sacred equipment during reconstruction. Sacred objects in the ancient Near East were sometimes carefully retired even when no religious revolution occurred. At Lachish, excavators identified a gate shrine that appeared to have been altered before the city's destruction in 701 BCE. An altar showed damaged horns. A stone object was interpreted by some as a symbolic toilet, and part of the shrine appeared blocked. This created a vivid narrative of deliberate desecration. Other scholars have challenged almost every part of that reconstruction. The marks on the altar may come from quarrying or construction. The supposed toilet may be another kind of installation. The evidence for blocking is limited. Cultic objects found in the front chamber alongside weapons from the final battle may indicate that ritual activity continued until the Assyrian attack. These disagreements reveal the central weakness in the traditional archaeological case. The supposed reform does not leave one consistent material signature. At one site an altar is reused as building stone. At another sacred objects are carefully buried. At another a shrine may have remained active. Uniform. Royal policy should perhaps produce more uniform results. Or perhaps that expectation is wrong. Ancient states did not operate through modern bureaucratic enforcement. A command issued in Jerusalem could be interpreted differently by officials, priests, families, and towns. One community might break an object. Another might bury it with respect. A local elite might comply publicly while preserving an object inside architecture. Resistance, compromise, delay, and symbolic obedience could all produce different archaeological traces. That possibility makes Tel Eton particularly interesting. Its stone was neutralized without being destroyed. The act resembles compliance and reluctance at the same time. Where the case becomes uncertain, the new study strengthens the case for religious change. It does not settle whether the change was Hezekiah's reform. The strongest skeptical explanation begins with ordinary building history. Building 101 changed across generations. Rooms were divided, doorways altered, walls added, and spaces repurposed. The standing stone may have lost its function during one of these transformations. Builders could have lowered it because moving 750 kilograms out of the building was difficult. A platform around it may have been the simplest way to reuse the room. That explanation accounts for the stone's position and the new platform. It is less successful at explaining why the object was preserved intact and handled in a way consistent with residual sacred value. Practical necessity and religious respect, however, are not mutually exclusive. The stone could have been both inconvenient and meaningful. 5. A second explanation is local religious change without royal reform. Households regularly change ritual practice. A new head of family, marriage alliance, inheritance, political appointment, or relationship with Jerusalem could alter which sacred objects remained acceptable. Tel Eton's elite may have voluntarily adopted a more Jerusalem-centered identity without receiving a direct order from the king. A third explanation shifts attention from religion to political survival. Judah's increasing centralization. Before the Assyrian invasion involved taxation, storage, defense, and royal administration. Local symbols of authority may have been reorganized as elites became more closely linked to the state. A cultic stone inside a residence could have been removed because the building's public role changed. There is also a textual problem. The biblical statement that Hezekiah removed high places and smashed standing stones may preserve a genuine memory, a later idealization, or a combination of both. The narrative could take a period of uneven religious and administrative centralization and compress it into the decisive action of a righteous king. One skeptical reconstruction proposes that centralization became a practical reality after Assyria devastated the countryside. Local sanctuaries disappeared because towns were destroyed, populations displaced, and the weakened kingdom lacked the resources to rebuild state-supported worship outside Jerusalem. Later writers could remember that outcome as an intentional reform. Tel Eden complicates that reconstruction because the stone was concealed before the final destruction, not afterward. Yet it does not completely defeat it. Local changes could have preceded the war for many reasons, and the archaeological sequence does not show how widespread they were. The best skeptical position is therefore not that the stone means nothing. It is that the evidence proves a local cultic transition and that attaching the king's name requires an additional argument the excavation cannot independently verify. A reform inside the home. The most original contribution of the Tel Eden study is its attention to domestic cult. Archaeological debates about royal reform usually focus on formal institutions, temples, gates, public altars, and fortress shrines. Those places are visible expressions of state religion. They are also unusually vulnerable to war, rebuilding, and political reinterpretation. Religion inside a residence operates differently. Household practice is woven into food preparation. Inheritance, memory, kinship, protection, and the daily organization of space. A standing stone in a prominent inner room could have been encountered during family gatherings, administrative meetings, seasonal rites, or decisions involving the wider community. Its removal would have changed not only theology but movement and behavior inside the house. This does not mean Building 101 was an ordinary family home. Its size and location suggest elite status. That may make it more relevant to royal policy. A governor or leading household could serve as the point where instructions from Jerusalem entered local society. The residents might combine domestic, administrative, and ceremonial functions. If Hezekiah attempted to centralize worship, implementation would not end when a public shrine closed. Local elites would have to change private rituals, remove symbols, redirect offerings, and explain why practices accepted by parents and grandparents were no longer authorized. That process would be socially difficult. Sacred objects do not become meaningless merely because a ruler changes policy. The careful concealment at Tel Eden fits that human problem. The stone's active role was ended, but the object was not violently destroyed. Whoever carried out the work may have accepted the new arrangement while still treating the old stone with caution or respect. 6. This is analytical inference, not a recovered eyewitness account. We do not know what the builders believed. But the physical sequence records negotiation more clearly than simple destruction would. The platform hides the old sacred feature and simultaneously preserves it. That pattern can explain why archaeological evidence for centralization appears inconsistent across Judah. Reform is rarely a single moment. It is a process that passes through institutions, households, and individual decisions. Public orders become local compromises. Some objects are broken. Others are buried. Some rituals survive quietly. Others disappear because the communities that practice them are destroyed. A kingdom-wide program, if it existed, would therefore not necessarily leave identical ruins. It could leave a landscape of uneven endings. The most realistic reconstruction. What is the most realistic explanation when the text, the archaeology, and the uncertainties are considered together? First, a real cultic change occurred inside Building 101. The stone's original display was intentional, and its later concealment was also intentional. The building remained active between those two arrangements. This is the firmest conclusion. Second, the change occurred before the Assyrian destruction of Tel Eden in the late 8th century BCE. That places it within the broad period of Hezekiah's rule and excludes Josiah's later reform as the immediate cause. Third, the political and religious environment of Judah makes a connection with centralization plausible. Jerusalem's administration was expanding. Assyrian pressure encouraged political consolidation. Biblical tradition remembered Hezekiah as a ruler who attacked local cult places. Other Judahite sites show that temples, altars, and ritual spaces were altered or abandoned around the same era. Fourth, the evidence is too imprecise to prove a direct royal order. The stone cannot identify the person who lowered it. The excavation cannot yet date the act to a specific year. The same archaeological behavior can arise from household succession, renovation, changing elite identity, or respectful retirement of a sacred object. The balanced reconstruction is therefore neither the Bible has been proved, nor the find has nothing to do with Hezekiah. The stone adds a new, independent example of cultic change before the end of the 8th century BCE. It supports the possibility that religious transformation reached beyond public sanctuaries into elite domestic space. When placed beside Arad, Beersheba, Lachish, the biblical tradition, and Judah's wider centralization, it makes some form of reform more historically credible. But the form may have been less complete than the later narrative suggests. It may have been selective, uneven, politically motivated, locally negotiated, and interrupted by war. The king may have encouraged centralization without eliminating every local practice. Later writers may have transformed a partial campaign into a cleaner moral revolution. History often works that way. Governments announce programs. Communities adapt them. Catastrophe interrupts them. Memory later removes the hesitation and turns a complicated process into a decisive moment. The Tel-Eton stone may be valuable precisely because it preserves the hesitation. 7. What one stone can and cannot prove. The stone from Building 101 is not a written record of Hezekiah. It is not an image of a forbidden god. It is not a royal decree trapped beneath a floor. Calling it proof of a biblical reform goes further than the excavation permits. What it does preserve is a sequence. A massive standing stone was erected in a place designed for visibility. It remained important enough that its removal required a deliberate rearrangement of the room. It was lowered, enclosed, and denied its former role. The residence continued to function. Later, the Assyrian destruction sealed the entire history beneath collapse. Those facts make the stone a material record of religious or symbolic change. The debate begins when we ask who caused it and why. The new study shifts the argument in a productive direction. Instead of looking only for a dramatic moment when every shrine in Judah was smashed, it asks how religious transformation might appear inside a household. The answer may not be a field of broken idols. It may be an old sacred object lying intact beneath a new everyday surface. What remains uncertain is equally important. We cannot date the concealment precisely. We cannot name the stone's deity or function. We cannot prove the occupant's office. We cannot demonstrate that the same policy reached every town. And we cannot use one carefully treated object to confirm every detail in Kings or Chronicles. Yet archaeology rarely recovers a signed explanation. It works through patterns, contexts, comparisons, and probabilities. Tel-Eton now adds one more pattern. Before the Assyrian armies ended the town's iron age life, someone inside its most prominent residents decided that a visible standing stone should no longer stand. That decision may have been part of Hezekiah's religious revolution. It may have been a local transformation later absorbed into the king's reputation. Either way, it reveals that Judah's religious history was being negotiated not only in temples and royal texts, but in rooms where people lived, cooked, governed, remembered, and changed their minds. And that leaves one specific question for the archaeological record: if a royal reform was carried into local homes by people who still respected the objects they were ordered to remove, should we expect to find evidence of violent destruction or more stones quietly preserved beneath the floors? 8.